On November 18th, 1929, 3 giant waves crashed over the Burin Peninsula. Homes were swept out to sea, fishing boats destroyed, and for some people, a season's catch of salt cod lost. The first sign of danger came at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. There was an earthquake on the Grand Banks that measured 7.2 on the Richter scale. It was so strong that ground tremors could be felt on the Burin Peninsula, about 265 kilometers away.
When suddenly this roar and this loud bang and the kettle and the plate started to dance, in a sense, on the stove. So, we panicked.
The earthquake triggered an underwater landslide that sent a tsunami racing towards land. The waves were giant, fast, and powerful. They reached the peninsula in about 2 hours.
I think around 7 o'clock, somebody screamed, and you could see the wave, forming and coming in the harbor. And as it came in, it became higher and higher as the space between narrowed.
2 more waves followed. In most places, the water swelled to a height of between 3 and 7 meters. But as the waves pushed into some of the peninsula's long, narrow bays, they grew in size and strength. Some were 27 meters high, about as tall as an 8-story building. It took just 30 minutes for the tsunami's 3 main waves to hit the Burin Peninsula. In that time, they wreaked incredible havoc. Houses were ripped from their foundations. Some were destroyed entirely. The lucky ones could still be salvaged. Waves poured into this house and drowned Sarah Rennie and her 3 children. A 4th child, Maggie, was later found alive upstairs. About 40 kilometers to the north, Fanny Kelly drowned with her 10-year-old daughter, Dorothy. Their bodies were never found. Thomas Hillier died trying to save his fishing boat from the waves. He left behind a pregnant wife. Henry Hillier lost his wife, Elizabeth, and 4 grandchildren. In Port-au-Bras, Thomas Fudge watched helplessly as his house was swept out to sea, his wife and 3 daughters trapped inside. Survivor Ern Cheeseman described the disaster in a letter to his brother.
We had all fled to the hills, the highest places we could find, from where we watched the 3rd wave come and go. You could hear the poor humans who were caught, screaming, women and men praying out loud. Oh God, Jack, it was terrible.
The tsunami killed 27 people that day. There was one more death in 1933 when Amelia Bonnell succumbed to her injuries. She was 4 years old when the tsunami struck. Her mother and sister both died in the disaster. After the 3rd wave, it took 2 hours for the water level to return to normal. Survivors began to look for the dead and injured. Any boats that had not been lost were used to save people washed out to sea or still in homes adrift on the water. The fishing flakes and wharves that for generations had lined the coastline were almost all gone, smashed to bits and replaced by a vast expanse of floating debris. People tried to salvage what they could from the rubble. Back on land, the houses still standing had to accommodate survivors. It was November and it was cold. The morning after the disaster brought with it a bitter snowstorm. There were other problems too. Food began to run out. Large quantities of vegetables and preserves and meat and fish that families had spent months storing away for the winter were gone, swallowed up by the Atlantic Ocean. Even worse, survivors had no way to call for help. A violent storm had recently severed the peninsula's only telegraph line. The outside world was completely unaware of a disaster that had affected more than 40 communities and 10,000 people. Finally, 3 days after the tsunami struck, the coastal boat Portia made a scheduled stop at Burin. Captain Westbury Kane described his shock to the Evening Telegram.
Imagine our wonder and surprise on turning the point of the channel to be met by a large store, drifting slowly along the shore, seaward. Then a short distance, another store or dwelling house, until 9 buildings were counted, strewn along the shore before the harbor was reached. On reaching the harbor, even a worse spectacle greeted the eyes.
The Portia immediately radioed St. John's. Help came quickly. The Newfoundland government dispatched the steamer Meagle to the Burin Peninsula. It was loaded with food, clothing, and medical supplies, and it carried a complement of doctors and nurses. Local newspapers reported daily on the disaster. The New York Times even printed a photo spread. A South Coast Disaster Committee formed to raise funds and distribute relief. It received dozens of letters from survivors in desperate need of help.
Dear sirs, have you got any clothes you could send me? I have a large family and lost everything I had in the tidal waves. I need the clothes badly. Celestine Edwards, Lawn.
Day after day, stories of heartbreak and courage emerged. One of the most celebrated was of Nurse Dorothy Cherry. She survived the tsunami and then spent 6 days walking from settlement to settlement, helping the wounded. The rescue ship Meagle finally picked her up at Lawn on November 24th. On board, Dr. H.M. Mosdell wrote glowingly of her efforts.
It must have been a superhuman effort for Nurse Cherry to make her way on foot all through the stricken area from Lameline to Lawn, a distance of 20 miles. She was found almost in a state of collapse after her strenuous and self-sacrificing efforts.
Donations poured in from across Newfoundland and Labrador, North America, and Britain. Houses were soon rebuilt, but the tsunami had dealt the peninsula's economy a devastating blow. Some local merchant firms had to close. Fishermen lost their boats and gear, and the cod fishery, the very engine of the peninsula's economy, was a failure for 3 years in a row. All this at the beginning of a decade-long Great Depression.
And it was years before some people recovered, and some never did. They just simply changed their way of earning a living by leaving St. Lawrence and going someplace else.
Many communities did not recover until the 1940s, when the Second World War initiated a new era of prosperity for all of Newfoundland and Labrador. The construction of a military base at nearby Argentia created jobs for the Burin Peninsula's residents. More than a decade after the tsunami had struck, its effects were finally being washed away.